today is if you make a contact and you learn one new thing and you feel a little emotion, because the feelings are what really help us learn. And I'm going to share with you, to start with, a poem from one of my favorite women writers. Her name is Marge Piercy, and it's called "The Moon is Always Female." And this is to honor Domestic Violence 2001. Where do we go from here? And it starts out, what can they do to you? Whatever they want. They can set you up, they can bust you, they can break your fingers, they can burn your brain with electricity, blur you with drugs till you can't walk, can't remember, they can take your child, they can wall up your lover, they can do anything you can't stop them from doing. How can you stop them? Alone, you can fight, you can refuse, you can take what revenge you can, but they will roll over you. But two people fighting back to back can cut through a mob, a snake dancing file, can break an army. Two people can keep each other sane. They can give support, conviction, love, massage, hope, sex. Three people are a delegation, a committee, a wedge. With four, you can play bridge and start an organization. With six, you can rent a whole house. You can eat a pie for dinner with no seconds and hold a fundraising party. A dozen make a demonstration, 100 fill a hall, 1,000 have solidarity and their own newsletter, 10,000 power and your own paper, 100,000 and your own media, 10 million and your own country. It goes on one at a time. It starts when you care to act. It starts when you do it again after they say no. It starts when you can say we and know who you mean. And each day you mean one more. And that is each of you in this room. You are making a difference in the world by your commitment, or you wouldn't be here. And I am honored this morning to introduce Susan Schnettler, who for over 20 years has been a warrior. She started in Boston in design programs to help women and children. She went on to New York, to Park Slope, which I know is a very difficult area, and started and designed programs for women. She went to Boston and started the first, in the Boston Pediatric Hospital, the first program for domestic violence. And now she is in Iowa, and I don't know what she's doing, or Ohio, I don't remember what, Iowa, but I don't know what she's doing there, but she has gone on and written, and later this afternoon at 4:30, we're going to be able to have her sign her book that she has co-authored. So I would like to have you welcome Susan, who is going to be our keynote speaker. Thank you.
To be back, and I wanted to welcome you all. And also, I wanted to give a special thanks to the conference organizers who had the vision to ask the speakers to think about where we would go, where we should go in the year 2001. Not very often do people call and ask you to think about a vision again. So I very much want to thank you for doing that, those of you who worked on this conference. I was asked to talk about women's services. Where do we go next? And I want to talk about a vision for the year 2001 with three components: services for women and children, the continuing need for institutional change so that we can have good services for women and children, and the need for a change in public consciousness. Before I go to the year 2001, I want to go back for a few minutes to the 1970s. I want to talk a little bit, even though the conference organizers asked me not to talk too much about the past. I want to talk a little bit about the past to assess what we've achieved, but also to challenge us to go back to some of our original visions of the work that still needs to be done. I chose a story to start my talk of a woman who was abused almost 20 years ago. Her reality might be very different today because of all the work we have done. And then again, it might not be different at all. For she was an alcoholic, battered woman. Her story offers us some of the directions for services and institutional change we need to take to make it better for all abused women, not just some abused women. The woman I interviewed was battered 20 years ago by her alcoholic husband, who is still a corporate executive in the upper middle class community they live in. He regularly punched and kicked her, threw her down the stairs, raped her, and destroyed her birth control. She thinks that 2 of her children were conceived after such attacks. So I asked her to tell me her story, and she said that in the 4th year of her marriage, she finally felt she had to do something. Now, this is before shelters existed or any services existed. And not knowing what else to do, she called her husband's parents to ask them for help. And they rushed to her house. They, not knowing what to do, called the family doctor, who, interestingly enough, made a home visit, which is something I don't think happens in many communities anymore. The family doctor tried to talk to her husband until he ordered him out of the house. And as he was leaving, the doctor, I again think not knowing what to do, gave the woman her first prescription for tranquilizers. Later that day, her husband punched his mother in the face, and the woman I interviewed commented, "I wanted to die. It was like watching him hit a priest." She was a religious Catholic woman. "I never told anyone else about the abuse for another 10 years. And this is where interventions that don't help aren't just neutral. They set you back a long way. It wasn't quite true, however, that she didn't try to tell anyone else about what was going on. When her husband started abusing their daughter, she would send her daughter to her fancy school in short sleeves and with no tights on in the middle of the winter, so hopefully a teacher would notice the bruise marks. She said, "I wanted a teacher to notice the bruise marks so that someone would call home and say, 'Will you please come in and tell me what's going on in your family?' But of course, nobody ever called." Listen to her 10 years later. These are her words. "I started to think that I was going crazy. My husband would say now and then, 'You're crazy,' and I just started to think that too. I was having problems sleeping at night. I would toss and turn and want to cry, but I couldn't." She begins to develop symptoms of post-traumatic stress. "I began going to doctors again for tranquilizers and sleeping pills, and they were aware of my family situation. I did finally again confide in my family doctors, and they just shook their heads, and gave me more medication." Later in the interview, I asked her, "Can you tell me how you got out of the relationship?" And I want you to listen to her first words to "How did you get out?" "I started to drink. That's what got me out. In the 11th year of my marriage, I started to drink after a really horrendous scene one morning. I went to the liquor cabinet and I filled my glass with straight bourbon and I started to sip, and my stomach stopped jumping around, the butterflies went, that gnawing feeling went, and I drank all day long. And nothing seemed to matter anymore, and I started to get a little bit of courage from the alcohol. And it allowed me to sleep at night. It was doing a lot of things that nothing else was doing, and it didn't hurt as much when he hit me anymore, because I would be anesthetized and I would hit him back." The alcohol, however, begins to cause her problems. "It gave me the false courage that I needed, and it was one of my allies. The problem was there was no time during the day that I felt safe without it, and I knew that I was getting into some trouble because I was having to buy more and more liquor, and I knew that was wrong. So I was having problems functioning, but I wasn't afraid. That was the thing. I wasn't afraid anymore. Although the fear subsides, she runs into a new set of troubling problems. And I asked her this question because I had heard other women I interviewed say that they felt like the drinking made them sometimes feel that they deserved to be treated so poorly. And she says, the drinking did make it worse. I started to think, what are people going to think of me? Now they'll think he really has a reason to do this. I started to think I had no credibility because I was drinking. I always felt like I was in a catch-22. Like if he didn't do these things, I wouldn't be doing this, and then because I'm doing this, nobody's going to help me. But I have to do this because I can't live this way anymore. That's when I made my last suicide attempt, when I could see no light whatsoever. Like other addicted, battered women, she does lose her credibility. She told me she finally got the courage to take her husband to court, and this is what happened. We took him to court for assault and battery finally. Now, this is years later. I was so afraid that the judge wouldn't believe me that I took a tranquilizer that morning. Then what happened, there was a court continuance to the afternoon. So her lawyer at lunch bought her a drink. And by the time, she says, I got into the courtroom, it was a disaster. Eventually, she, the wife of an upper middle class corporate executive, also lost custody of her children to their alcoholic father, who never admitted he had a drinking problem or a violence problem. Before she entered a drug treatment program, she spent 3 years on the streets of a major city as what she called a bag lady. Now, I need to stop for a minute before I go on with my talk, since the story is so upsetting. I just want to tell you the outcome about her so that I don't leave you with this. When I met her because I was interviewing women who had left abusive relationships, and I was at a battered women's program, and she walked in with a woman she had just interviewed and done a drug history on, and she said to me, I want to tell you my story so that you tell other people my story so it doesn't happen to the next woman. And her story was that she went into drug treatment. She now works in a drug and alcohol treatment program. She is the counselor, unfortunately the only one, as she told me, in her program who asks every woman who comes in their past history and their current experiences with violence. And she said, I bring the women I work with to the Battered Women's Program, and I'm okay. And I don't mean that she's okay that some of the effects of what she lived through don't linger, because they do. But she said, I'm telling you this so that you tell the audiences you speak to that they need to ask women what happened, and they need to do something differently. So I'm telling you her story, so hopefully it will help the next woman. She's really gone on to rebuild her life. Now, however, if we go back to her story was, and in many places still is, the outcome of what society calls a private family affair. And sometimes, unfortunately, the battered women's movement calls women we are not equipped to serve. The woman keeps repeating, I had nobody except the drink. The doctors went, I had no allies. My courage was the alcohol. I was alone without a human support. What did we do to her 25 years ago to make her so alone? And as you will hear later, how do we continue to do this, at least for some groups of women? First, as you heard her say, we made her invisible. The violence against her was something people refused to acknowledge. We made her culpable if she forced her visibility on us. And we acted as if there were no abusive power dynamics operating in the family, what we continue to call the haven in the heartless world. How did we do this? And I want to just remind us of how we did this, because it's how we continue to do it, and it's what we still have to challenge. How did we make her invisible, culpable, and ashamed? What I want to suggest, because it's critical to where we need to continue to move, is that institutions colluded with her batterer, And I want to start with them. First, psychology, psychiatry, and social work. And remind us, some of you know this, and this is something I wrote about in Women in Male Violence in 1982, but to me it still holds in terms of some of our professional practices. From 1939 to 1969, as many of you know, the index of the Journal of Marriage and the Family contained no reference to violence. Supposedly battered women did not exist. Or if the literature did acknowledge battered women, the women themselves were frequently labeled the cause of their own problems. For example, a 1964 article in the Archives of General Psychiatry describes battered women as, quote, aggressive, efficient, I don't know what that means, aggressive, efficient, masculine, and sexually frigid, unquote. As evidence, the authors described the one woman who did not regret calling the police and who said she would take legal action again against her abuser. The writers labeled this woman as the most masculine of all. For her display of strength and courage, for her efforts to stop the violence, the authors chose to label, dismiss, and demean her. Throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, the derogatory and victim-blaming labels shifted back and forth. Sometimes battered women were described as too masculine and sometimes too feminine. Women were too assertive and we were too passive. But we were always culpable. Victim provocation theories, however, were not confined to academic journals and psychotherapy. Their assumptions are echoed by medical, law enforcement, and social service institutions, and thus have a profound impact on battered women. As I was putting this talk together, I went back, and again, this is something I wrote in 1982 in Women in Male Violence, and unfortunately, I think is still what we have in many communities today, and is still a challenge we have to carry forward into the 90s in terms of changing the reality I'm about to describe. In 1976, researchers examined the entire medical histories of all women who came to the surgical emergency room at a large metropolitan hospital. This pilot study, analyzing the medical records of 481 women, found that, quote, of the more than 1,400 injuries these women had ever brought to this hospital, physicians had identified 75 abusive incidents, although an additional 340, or 24%, fell into the probable or suggestive categories of this methodology. In other words, of probably 1,400 injuries, they identified 75. The findings suggest that battering is perhaps 10 times more frequent than physicians acknowledge. Equally disturbing is the response to battered women when, for example, their x-rays and lab tests are normal, but their complaints persist. The authors found that they were labeled neurotic, hysteric, hypochondriac, or a well-known patient with multiple vague complaints. One non-battered woman in 50 leaves the hospital with one of these labels. One battered woman in 4 does, and is given tranquilizers, sleeping medication, or further psychiatric care. The study is important not only because it traces how widespread battering is, but also because it traces how the real issue, violence, is hidden and the woman herself labeled the problem. I'm going to talk about the medical response for the 90s later and draw back on some of this in terms of what has changed and what still remains to change, which is quite a bit. There was one final profound way to make women invisible, which was that you could not escape the violence. And I just want to remind you in terms of where we have come from, even though there's a long way to go, that for those of you who get discouraged, I would like to remind you that in 1973, a Los Angeles survey found that there were 4,000 beds in Los Angeles for men and 30 for women and children. None of those 30 beds was for mothers with sons older than 4. In 1976 in New York City, with 8 million people, there were 1,000 beds for homeless women and there were 1,000 beds for homeless men and 45 for homeless women. We have indeed begun to change that reality, and quite dramatically, not far enough. What broke through this invisibility? The work of the women's movement allowed us to say, finally, that violence against women was not an aberration, but rather a reality that millions of women experience. We could label violence a form of control that robs us of our self-confidence, freedom, and dignity. Out of these insights came 3 practical solutions: shelter, and these are for the first time, shelter, public education about violence against women, and legal and criminal justice reform. By 1975, as a result of the women's movement, battered women were coming forward, and they made us listen to their reality. They courageously told their stories, and we finally heard that many women had nowhere to go and that they lived in a constant fear of re-victimization from their abusers. They had a need for safety and support that this society was not providing. As our movement grew, we could say, finally, that the lack of resources in women's lives was the real issue. An issue that the community, not the individual, must solve. And as a result, the shelter, a house of refuge for women and children, was born. Before 1975, there were only a handful of these institutions in the United States. Today, there are more than 1,200 shelters. Most were started by groups of community women who had no money, but who were determined to make the world a better place for all of us. I also should say, and Barbara Hart's going to talk much more about this tomorrow, we also made tremendous changes in the law. In many places now, in almost every state, there are legal remedies and legal protections that never existed. And my own personal story to you is when I started this work in 1976 in Chicago, women would call us and say, I got a peace bond. And then he assaulted me again, and I went back to the court, and we started to call the court, and we found, of course, there was no such thing as a record of any of these peace bonds. They were pieces of paper that got dropped into the garbage cans. And you couldn't get a protective order where I lived in 1976 unless you had filed for divorce. So that when I think that it's been 15 years and that this reality has both changed enormously and still has a very long way to go, I often think of those moments in 1976 when women would call and say, I'm in a phone booth with my kids in. There is no such thing here as a shelter. And there is no such thing except a peace bond, which was a meaningless piece of paper. So, now, the final thing I want to say, and then I want to go on to the future, is that the third major area of change, I think, was in consciousness, both our own and the public's. And this is, again, my third area of where I want us to continue our work. First of all, we totally transformed how we at least see battering. We have named it, so now we can say it can no longer be hidden. It's not a private problem, it's a public problem. It's a social problem. If you can't name what you're living through, you have nobody to talk to about it, and you have no solutions publicly to help you. You have no language. If you have no language, we have to stay in silence and alone. So we have given words, we have given names to this issue. We now see that power operates inside the family, and that some people have less power than others, and other people abuse power, and that we can label violence and abuse of power. We also see that institutions are not neutral. By not intervening, they are taking a stand on the side of the batterer, either wittingly or unwittingly. By not intervening, they are allowing a woman to be re-victimized and terrorized, which is a support to the batterer. They are telling men that they can get away with violence against women. We have also said that our traditional ways of intervening, the ways many of us were taught to intervene, don't really work, and in fact, they're often dangerous. So our change in consciousness has helped us say that couples treatment, that mediation, that interventions that are done with other families are in fact dangerous because of the power abuse. And then finally, and this is where I want to now leap off into the future, we have said as a movement that solutions must say that the community and its institutions have to take a stand against the violence. So as I move into the 90s and into the year 2000, I want to talk about the need for additional services, new services, and for institutional change. The first thing I want to propose to you or talk about is our need, and by the way, I realize I have to say this to this audience. I have only lived in extremely urban places, Chicago, Boston, and New York, and I was born in St. Louis. Now, I live in Iowa, so my perspective is beginning to change, but I haven't lived there for very long. So some of what I might say might have a very strong urban slant, and I hope that we can dialogue about this and also say what makes sense and what doesn't make sense in the communities that you live in. I want to talk about our need as a movement to go to women where they and their children seek help. Why I want to do this, I'm going to give you some figures in a few minutes from a study I just did in Boston about battered women and abused children in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. But and what I found, I think, has been replicated in several other places. For instance, the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence estimates that even with mandatory arrest of abusers, with victim advocates in every courtroom in the state, and more shelters than they've ever had before, that they are only reaching 10% of the women in Connecticut who could use their help. So what I want to think about, and I realize that much of what I'm going to say in the next half hour isn't work we're going to get accomplished today, but it is a vision for me of where I want us to go in the future, is that I'd like to think about how to reach all the women who never come to our programs. I'd like to think about all the women who say, I'm not going to go to a shelter for abused women, or I'm not going to go to a Safe Homes Network. And when I think about those women, I think, where do women go for help? Or where are they forced to go sometimes for help? And I think about the criminal justice system, the healthcare facilities in their community, both for themselves and for their children. I think about mental health centers, mental hospitals, family service agencies, and then the other thing I think about are child welfare agencies and child protective agencies. I will tell you that in Massachusetts, our Child Protective Agency 2 years ago did a study. This is before workers were required to ask about domestic violence. They went back and looked at 200 substantiated child abuse cases and found that 30% of those cases had evidence of violence against the mother just documented in the case record. This is before workers were required to ask. Now in the most high-risk units in the department where they evaluate the most high-risk child abuse cases, several of those units are suggesting that 70% of the mothers in the most high-risk child abuse cases are battered women. So that is why, for me, child protective agencies and child welfare agencies, especially those that work with abused kids, are a place where we're going to find many battered women. Now, when I think about those agencies and that there are thousands and probably millions of abused women who are either using or are forced to use those agencies, I would think about a set of policies and procedures or guidelines that I would like to go to those agencies with. And I borrowed these from Russell and Rebecca Dobash, authors of Violence Against Wives. First of all, the principles they suggest are, 1, do the policies, procedures, and services of the agency protect and empower the woman who's been victimized? 2, does the agency hold the abuser accountable for the behavior? And 3, do institutions in the community hold each other accountable for stopping the violence and protecting the victims of the violence? I want to go through those again. To me, these are the principles we need to take forward into every agency in the community. Do we protect and empower? And I should add, for me now, after working with abused children and battered women, do we protect and empower every victim in the family? Because often, at least in my work, there's more than one. Do we hold the abuser accountable for the behavior? And do we hold ourselves and other institutions in the community accountable for stopping the violence and for protecting anyone who's being victimized? This may mean, I think, a massive reframing when we go to community institutions. We have to help them change how they see the nature of this problem. And let me give you an example. 6.5 years ago, several people on the staff of Boston Children's Hospital, where I'm still affiliated, came to us and said, in child abuse cases, we think we're seeing some battered women. And they gave examples of, for instance, in the middle of a family interview where they were assessing in a court-ordered interview. The court had ordered an evaluation of parents to see how they would parent their children and who should have custody. In the middle of one of these interviews with a mother and father, the father got up, started pacing the floor, and lunged for his wife's throat in the middle of the interview. They broke that up and then sent the family home, right? And people in the hospital at least were sensitive enough to say, did we just endanger this woman and child further? And the answer was, of course you did. But they knew it, right? Now, these kind of interviews are standard practice, by the way, in many healthcare settings, and certainly in many child welfare interventions, where you interview the parents together. And in another example, the hospital was working with a mother and father in, again, a court-ordered evaluation, and they said this mother is terrific with her kids, and her kids are completely attached to her, but he keeps coming back and beating her up. And he is so violent and so dangerous, we think the kids can't be returned home. And eventually this woman's parental rights were terminated, not because she wasn't a good parent, but because, quote, she failed to protect her kids from this man who battered. So these were the couple of the kinds of examples. But when we went to the hospital and said, well, then let's have a different kind of intervention inside the hospital, and when we said let's have a battered woman's advocate inside the hospital, it was very interesting because we got two kinds of responses that we had to help change. And this is this question of how we have to go inside these institutions and begin to reframe how they understand the problem. The first response that we got from most people was, oh no, we don't have this problem here. Even though I just gave you these two examples, and the people who gave me the example obviously thought they had a problem, right? But many other people said to us, oh, we don't have these cases here. This is a pediatric hospital with a very large child protection team, but we don't have these cases here. They don't exist. Even though we now know, depending again on whose research you look at, there may be as much as a 30 to 50% overlap in battered women and child abuse cases. The second response was, as the examples I chose, I think, illustrate, that people in the healthcare system frame the women, even non-abusive, non-violent, very caring mothers, as women who failed to protect their kids. And because of the way they framed the women, all they could do was put pressure on the women. And guess what else they did, as would seem obvious from this, is the abuser's responsibility for the violence totally disappeared. Who did you want to get your hands on? The mother, right? So, of course, what that did was leave the woman totally alone point the finger at her partner, to stand up to him totally alone, and to try to get him out of the house if she wanted to keep her kids. What we then began to argue with people was, if you're going to leave her alone with a violent and assaultive person and not take a stand on her behalf, she's going to have to stay silent. She's going to have to run away from you. The very thing she wants to do, which is protect her children, we're going to put her in a position that she's not going to be able to. So we went back to them and said, the problem isn't the women. The problem is the health care response to the women. If we gave the women advocacy and support, we think that many women would be very eager to take it and clearly want to protect their children. And by the way, I should tell you, we have 5.5 years later either seen or helped consult with about 800 women and their kids. This is, again, in a facility where we didn't have any of these women, right? We've seen 800 of women or helped people work with 800 women and their children. We don't have any much follow-up research evaluation money, but we did follow 46 women for 15 months after we initially helped them. These are battered women with abused children. And we found that at 15 months of follow-up, 80% of the women reported to us that they and their children were safe. And only two kids were in foster care, which we think is probably much less than would have been in another population of battered women with abused kids. What we had to do is help the hospital develop a different framework. And we began to raise questions like, why were the social workers and the child protective workers not taking a stand against the violence, and instead of blaming the mothers for it, trying to help the mothers free themselves from it? Instead of conceptualizing women as failing to protect, we should say the batterer is terrorizing people and has to be held accountable for the behavior. In other words, we tried to flip the framework off of the woman onto the assaultive person. And we said that our response, women can respond when they are protected and helped, and that advocacy had to be put in place so that she could do what she needed to do. And what I want to suggest is that in hospitals and in child protective systems, if there's two major places that we haven't touched yet in terms of a vision of where we should go for services and institutional change, to me, it's health care and child protection. And we have plenty of evidence to suggest that hospitals with protocols in place identify about 30% of their female emergency room trauma patients as battered. 30%. Without protocols, or when protocols disappear from disuse, they identify about 4 or 5% of the patients as battered. The women just disappear. They're still there. Nobody identifies them. So one of the things I would very much like us to do is take our advocacy efforts inside healthcare and child protection, either by training those people to work with battered women in their facilities, or by letting us come into their facilities to work with the women. I think a model of working could take many different forms. But I know that there are a lot of women that you could reach this way. One of the things that we just found, I'll give you another example. In Massachusetts, our Department of Social Services, which is our child protective agency, began to say we have to do something differently about domestic violence instead of ignore it, because several children of battered women were killed. Children who were in their caseload, they were killed by their mother's batterer. And one of the things that they have now done is that in 2 of the area child protection offices, any worker who wanted to volunteer could volunteer to be specially trained to work with domestic violence and child abuse cases. And what they did in those area offices, and by the way, it was only volunteers, so people were not forced to do this work who did not want to do it. Those workers were trained by the department's newly hired battered woman's advocate, who is a former battered woman who's been doing advocacy in shelter for years. and they started a batterers treatment group or a batterers rehabilitation group. Now, when you look at service plans for women in those two area offices, by the way, I started reading service plans. Our department let me read some of their service plans. And some of the women at the hospital let us read their service plans. And as you all well know, I'm sure, the women's service plans in child protective cases look like this. You know, they were endless. You will do these 15 things. But the man's service plan, even again when the woman had no allegations of abuse against her, was often looked like this. It had one or two things on it. So what we now are doing with the writing of service plans is, again, trying to flip the worker's framework so that the abuser is held accountable for the behavior, and the woman is offered much more safety planning and support. Every worker's been taught to do safety planning in a way that they didn't have any idea how to do before. They also now sit as part of what they call a multidisciplinary team of battered women's advocates from the shelter, workers, batterers treatment program, probation, parole, to talk about what to do differently in overlapping domestic violence and child abuse cases. And I can't tell you yet the outcome of this, but at least we're beginning to see where the workers are no longer blaming the mothers they're working with for the child abuse that's happening, just blanketly blaming them. And we have to see in about a few years, you should ask me what begins to happen with this experiment. But I think it's a hopeful sign in terms of trying to create services based on a new model of how the institution should respond. The other thing I wanted to talk about for a few minutes in terms of services is that I wanted to look at the information I just collected from Massachusetts to back up, again, this need to go into new systems to do work. Can you see this? Can you over here see this at all? No? Of course not. Can you see it back there? How far do I have to? You all can't see it. I'll just read this to you. What I did was I wanted to look at, I was lucky enough to get a grant to look at the problem of battered women and abused children in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And the more I did the research for this grant, the more I realized why so many of us who work in services for abused women are so often burned out, and why we need to go back and make a demand for more resources. It was so clear to me after I put all these numbers together, and I wanted to share it with you in the hope that some of your states might allow some of you to do the same thing that I just got a chance to do. This says estimates of the number of abused women, nationally married women who are annually beaten, according to Geller, Strauss, and Steinmetz, and I had to use their numbers because they're the only ones who did a national survey, even though we have a lot of trouble with how they did their research, was 1.8 million women are beaten. That's not the lower end of their conflict tactic scale pushed, right? I mean, this is severe abuse. Now, I took their numbers and tried to figure out how many women in Massachusetts who are married or cohabiting experience what they call severe violence, even though, again, I don't necessarily agree with how they did their research. But when I used their severe violence numbers, I found that about 45,000 women annually in Massachusetts would experience what they called severe abuse, and about 135,000 women would experience slapping and pushing annually. That totals about 180,000 women. We couldn't get any estimate of the number of women who were dating, separated, and divorced. And of course, we would add a lot more women to those numbers if we had an accurate estimate. And then, when you look at people's lifetime incidence of a third to a fifth to a third of all adult women are abused, then 20% of 2.4 million adult females in Massachusetts would give us 480,000 women. And a third of the 2.4 million adult females in Massachusetts would give us 792,000 women. Now, what this does, again, just give us some sense of what's happened to our work in the last few years. These are service statistics from the Massachusetts Coalition of Battered Women's Service Groups. Hotline calls in 1985 were 34,000 hotline calls. By 1991, and this is because of all the work we have done, public education, change in consciousness, by 1991, hotline calls had gone from 34,000 in 1985 to 69,000 hotline calls. Court accompaniment in 1989, 2.5 years ago, was 6,600 women. By 1991, we had accompanied 9,400 women to court. Does this parallel what any of you are experiencing? Maybe not the numbers are so large, but the increases? Now, women sheltered had gone down just by about 100 and from 90 to 91, and mostly people believe that that's because we have so drastically cut housing subsidies in our state that women don't go to shelter because there's two things people think. Either they're staying longer in shelter so fewer women can come, which is one of the things that's going on, and some women aren't leaving because they know they can't find housing afterwards. And that's why their support group service statistics are also going down. But I want to give you one more statistic about numbers going up. In Massachusetts, in 1990, restraining orders, there were 33,000 restraining orders given by our courts. In 1991, there were 44,000 restraining orders given by our courts. In 1 year, it went up 22%. In 1 year. 44,000 women. Now, let me show you what we have for staff. 23 of 28 battered women's programs responded to my survey. So I didn't have all 28 programs in our state, but of the 23 that responded to my survey, we had 12 paid child advocates on staff in 1991. The budget for 9 of these 23 programs in terms of children's services was nothing. Only 2 programs had more than $35,000 a year for children's services. Now, if we look at total paid direct service staff 1991 in the entire state, we had 148 paid direct service staff, and we served 18,600 women. That's about 1 paid worker for every 148 people. Now, if we wonder why we are completely burned out, this brought it home to me. I always said this, I mean, I knew this, we all know this, we talk about this all the time, but I think having to actually look at the number of women and children we serve, how much money we get to do it, how many people we have on either paid or volunteer to do it, makes you understand why you can't do more, why you want to do more. And so I know that when I'm standing up here saying, oh, I have this vision of all the things we could do, that part of why we can't do what we need to do is because of resources. And I think we have to go back and remind ourselves of that. And I think we have to go back and remind our communities and our state legislators. Part of what we want to do as a result of this is go back and we're going to ask the legislature for money for just a 6-month study of the service needs of battered women in Massachusetts for safety, just to provide basic safety for women in our state and a very diverse group of women in terms of linguistically and ethnically and racially, because there are things that work for one community that totally will not work in terms of safety. And what it would take to have programs in place that would provide basic safety, going back to the demand that we have a right for basic safety for women and children and the right for them to be free from harm. We were going to try to document where we are turning women away because we don't have shelter beds, and where there are huge distances to travel and there are no shelter beds. So we want to go back and in the 6 months make a plan and say this is the need and this is what would be required for safety. Part of the reason we are now this is the tragedy then and the continuing dilemma for so many of us, part of the reason our legislature is now interested is because a woman is being killed in Massachusetts once a week. And there is a complete outcry because of this, and the Women's Caucus of the state legislature has declared a public safety emergency for battered women, and now the governor has. And because of this, we're now saying we have got to go back and have a demand for basic safety services. I want to show you one more thing. This goes back to my argument earlier that if we served 18,000 women in battered women's programs in Massachusetts in 1991, the prevalence rate of abuse that year for married and cohabiting women was 180,000. In other words, just like the Connecticut number I gave you earlier in my talk, we were seeing about 1 out of 10 women in our programs who are abused. Now, when I say that, final thing is, what would my vision be for services for women and kids? What I would like to do, and I know we will not do this next year, but I would like to do pieces of this year by year by year, is just as many of you know the Duluth model, which means a community intervention model that says the criminal justice system and the community is responsible for stopping the offender's behavior, holding him accountable, and we are there in the system to do advocacy to make it work for women. Are you all familiar with this model? Everybody seems to know this model, right? Well, my vision up here is, why doesn't the whole entire community become an intervention model? So that it's not just, not that I think we should spend time reforming the criminal justice system. I think it's very important. However, a lot of women never use it. Some women only use the healthcare system. Some women only talk to their priests, ministers, rabbis. Some women end up only at a school where their child is, or in a child protective agency because of a child abuse report. Some women end up in drug treatment programs and never have contact with programs for abused women. So what my vision would be is, what would one community look like where everybody said, we hold the offender accountable, we support the woman, and we're there to protect and empower. And that means health care and child protection and mental health. So this is what I wrote here when I was thinking about Massachusetts for the future, that there would be services, practice guidelines, and policies from every agency who all agreed to participate together on some kind of training and multidisciplinary team in all our court systems, including the courts where child protection cases are heard, and care and protection and termination of parental rights cases, all these kind of court systems where battered women go, that there be advocates in hospitals and community health centers, in child protective agencies, there'd be battered treatment or rehabilitation programs with links to the courts, with links to child protection and services for abused women. One of the other things I think a community model of protecting women and kids would include is a visitation center. We know, and I know you all know very well, that many women get assaulted after they've separated from their partners. In fact, it can be the most dangerous time, and that during visitation is when women and kids again get assaulted, threatened, terrorized. There is now a growing movement across the country. By the way, the first national conference, were any of you at the first national conference on visitation centers? There was just one on the East Coast, so I think in New York City, that the visitation center becomes a great, comfortable, caring place for the child, but the woman drops the child off and the abusive person enters from a completely different entrance, and there is no contact, and there are people around. And so this is, again, another part of my vision of what a community net of intervention and safety would look like. Train daycare and school personnel to identify and educate parents and kids. And then finally, one of the major problems we still hear for abused women, and I bet you do too, is the lack of legal representation, that you can't have safety if you can't get legal representation. And what I'm finding is, especially, and I know you must be too, in the cases that involve custody and visitation, Those are the very moments in the communities I've lived in where women can't find legal representation. Yeah? No, go ahead.
I'm having trouble keeping up and reading this. Is it possible that we could get some photocopies? Of
Sure. Can we do that?
Yeah.
Okay, absolutely. Everyone's scribbling, I'm sorry. And you never read your notes again, right? Because you can't read them. I'm sorry. I have a little bit more I want to say, but are there questions about this? Now, I know that we can't do all of this immediately, but part of this vision of creating this network is that I think about, I want to try this in, now again, this is my urban background, I want to try this in one community in Boston. A pilot project where we just do policies and procedures for every single agency and teach that agency staff how to do this work right. And so if you were in a state that one community tried this in, they could then become the model for every other hospital in the state. They could train, that hospital could then train the other hospitals in the state. I know what I'm trying to argue with us is we cannot humanly do all the work that needs to be done. And we have to now go back to those systems and say to them, with our help and collaboration, can we teach you what needs to be done? And then let them go be teachers for other people with us. And that there needs to be some way we find to collaborate and to push them to change, but then to use them to train and teach other people how to do the work. That we cannot any longer be the only institution in our communities that care about battered women. So that's part of what I'm arguing. Now, I want to do one more thing about public consciousness, and then I'm going to stop. I think that we need public consciousness that continues, public education that continues to articulate women's right to be free from harm, that refuses to hide violence, and that refuses to blame the victim for it or deny the offender's accountability for it. Now, and I wanted to suggest to you that we are still struggling with that problem of public consciousness and public perception. And I chose to read you excerpts from an article that did not appear in 1972. It appeared in 1989 in the Baltimore Sun. I just want to read it to you. This is a man who killed his wife and got 10-year maximum term. And what it says is that Kevin Lee Kern received the maximum 10-year sentence for strangling his wife in what he said was a fit of jealous rage last year after, and I want you to listen to the newspaper's words, after he, quote, collected her from a bar, punched her, made love to her in the woods near their home, then was told their youngest child wasn't his. Pre-sentence reports on skipping around revealed yesterday that Kern has had a serious drinking problem since his teens, several drunken driving arrests, drug use, including LSD, PCP, amphetamines, and marijuana. During the trial, he was portrayed as devastated by his wife's drinking, her broken promises to quit, and her infidelities, which culminated in, quote, a crime of passion. And now we listen to his attorney. Kevin Kern loved his wife. His support for his wife, his love for his wife, his willingness to stay with her were evident in his life, the defense attorney said. In this report from 1989, Denise Kern is invisible and culpable. She's the one to blame. Still, the story is told completely from the batterer's perspective, as if it were a true account, as if reality were being interpreted through both people's eyes, even though it's not. Would Denise Kern describe herself as collected from a bar by Kevin Would Denise Kern describe her experiences in the woods just before she was killed as lovemaking? Does having an affair, even if she did have one, justify her murder? And don't we know by now that a primary mechanism of men who batter is to accuse their wives of having affairs as a way to excuse their violence? When will we stop confusing the batterer's description with the total possession and control of another human being? It is this kind of public accounting and discussion of violence that I want us, in terms of public consciousness, to now continue to challenge. That every time one of these appears in our local newspaper, and they still continue to appear with extraordinary frequency, at least where I live, that we insist that the truth be told, that we insist that this is justifying and excusing and rationalizing violence and blaming victims, and that we again go about the business of public education. Saying all that, I think that I want to try to pull together the pieces of this, of what I've just gone through with you. Our success in the last 15 years, and it really has been an extraordinary success, means that more and more women are coming to us and asking for help, and more women are going to systems and asking for help. Our very success, however, comes at a time of massive cutbacks in services and resources for women, and that is not our fault. It's a massive cutback in resources for women, for poor people, and for people of color. And it comes at a time of a conservative backlash. Not only do we face, again, this lack of resources, but we certain things and certain issues now face us that we didn't know about in the 1970s. We didn't work with women with AIDS in the 1970s. We didn't have as many women with severe drug problems coming to our programs in the 1970s. We did not envision the number of people made homeless by callous housing policies in this country. So in some ways, the situation has gotten worse, and the demands on us have gotten more severe, and our success means that more people are coming to us, so that you now face a bunch of issues in terms of envisioning where to go that basically say to you, we've got to just hold the line. You know, how can we go forward? What can we do next? We've just got to be able to survive on a daily basis. And what I want us to remember when we're in that context is a couple of things. One, that if you can't go forward right now, or you can't do everything you want to do, don't blame yourself for it. Look at those statistics and the amount of resources you get. And also don't turn your anger on the women you're trying to help, or on each other. And it's real easy to do because there's a lot of reason to be angry. And the second thing I want to remind us of as a way of closing is that we borrowed our earliest vision of what we were doing. In some ways, we borrowed it from the civil rights movement. And that movement said that people who have suffered an injustice were capable of organizing to put an end to that injustice. And in our case, I think that's battered women. And I think that their involvement in deciding what agendas we set in our own communities for services and social change is what we have to turn back to. The energy for this kind of struggle comes from the sense of injustice that they have suffered, but also the sense of community we are trying to create together. It comes from anger, but it also comes from our laughter together and our sense of support for each other. It comes from a great generosity that is often present in our work. And so when I think about the future and what vision you want to go back to your communities with, and It is a vision of talking to the women you work with, and including them in what will change in the negotiation with agencies, letting them tell their stories and letting them say, this is what we think would make us safer in the communities we live in. And it is also now, I think, joining with those professionals within institutions like healthcare who finally are saying, we know now that domestic violence is the leading source of injury to women, and it is time for us to do something differently. So I think it's trying to, again, tap into the energy of the women we work with and the energy of those people in our communities who care, to sit down together and ask, what is your vision of what we could do to make it better for everybody? Thank you.
It's interesting because Susan Schechter brought out very clearly how community institutions traditionally have ignored domestic violence or tacitly condoned it. And I found that historians are very similar. The lack of interest in women's history has been gradually being rectified in the last 15 to 20 years, so that people like me are in business. But I recently did a literature search in American women's history, and out of over 300 book and article titles, only 4 dealt with domestic violence. And yet it was as much a historical phenomenon as it is a current phenomenon today. So that tells you how far we have to go in my profession. Oops, excuse me, addressing that. There, okay. Talking with Susan after her presentation made me aware that that the healing and the prevention goes on 2 levels. There's the community level, where the institutions begin to recognize and address domestic violence. And then I think in the personal level, when women begin to let go of the shame that our culture encourages us to carry around. And when I talk about the shame, I'm talking about the idea of toxic shame, not healthy shame. Toxic shame being, I don't deserve things, I'm a bad person. Healthy shame being, oh, I made a mistake and I can recognize that and deal with it. And when I think about domestic violence on the personal level, to me, I've never been physically or sexually abused, but to me, the kind of toxic shame that our culture encourages women to have simply creates a spectrum, and domestic violence is one end of the spectrum that results when women don't think they deserve better treatment. And in my case, my end of the spectrum has incorporated a whole range of behaviors, from being too apologetic about things, to being perfectionist, to being afraid to make mistakes, and that kind of thing. So in the interests of modeling healthy shame instead of toxic shame, I'm going to be honest with you. I missed my proper time to comment this morning because I mistakenly thought I should be here at 11:30 instead of 9:30. So, and I appreciate how gracious the conference organizers have been in allowing me to speak, even though I'm late. So again, it's good to be here. What I'd like to do is offer some historical perspectives on domestic violence from Montana. And these will demonstrate how divorce law, in some cases, again, tacitly condoned domestic violence, and how even when the law was structured in a way that presumably could protect women from domestic violence, the way that it was interpreted often still resulted in condoning domestic violence. And so again, it will be an example of how community institutions were not working to protect women from this kind of behavior or to encourage alternative behaviors instead. Divorce law in Montana in 1895 said that a divorce could be granted for any of the following causes. 1, adultery. 2, extreme cruelty, which, as you'll see, could be very broadly defined. 3, willful desertion. 4, willful neglect, which translated to failure to provide income, because at that time the man was assumed to be the breadwinner. and 5, habitual intemperance, in other words, alcoholism, and 6, conviction of a felony. Now, in 1895, the definition of extreme cruelty was as follows. The law in Montana defined extreme cruelty as the infliction or threat of bodily injury dangerous to life, or the repeated, and I'm emphasizing that word, the repeated infliction or threat of grievous bodily injury upon the other party by one party to the marriage. And then it went on to specify that one beating or whipping of a wife by her husband is sufficient to warrant a divorce. And this is remarkable because in some other states the law required a certain number of occasions of brutality or a year's worth before you could actually file for divorce. So Montana law in 1895 was relatively liberal in this regard. However, the way that it worked in practice was not so liberal. A recent study showed that in Butte, Montana, there were numerous cases where a woman would file for divorce because her husband had beaten her. However, the courts would usually decide against her unless she brought in additional charges of willful neglect. In other words, unless she buttressed up that charge of physical cruelty with the charge that her husband wasn't supporting her, the courts would usually throw out her case or not treat it seriously. And the reason for this was that the community in Butte, or the public servants in Butte, were concerned with keeping women off the welfare rolls. And this was a largely working class community. And so they wanted to enforce the law in a manner that would encourage men to provide for their wives responsibly. They really weren't addressing any encouragement of behavior that would be not cruel. In other words, domestic violence wasn't an issue for them. So case after case would come forward with an element of domestic violence, but yet the case would be decided on the element of willful neglect, in other words, economic providership by the husband. And I think that's a great example of how the law was interpreted in a way which tacitly condoned domestic violence. Now, by 1907, this tacit condemnation of domestic violence became incorporated into the letter of the law with a change in the civil codes. And what happened was, in 1907, divorce law changed, and on the one hand, it added the phrase that extreme cruelty could be defined simply as the infliction of grievous mental suffering. Now that appears to be a liberalization. The idea that there can be forms of emotional battering that are just as devastating as physical battering. Things like public humiliation or fear and intimidation. And this part of the law was a response to cases which had come before the courts in the previous 10 or 15 years, where, for example, a husband would publicly humiliate his wife who had been true to him by accusing her of infidelity in front of others, so that she would be very humiliated. Particularly a late 19th century woman who was raised in, quote, the cult of true womanhood, which was a Victorian value system which emphasized women's moral superiority to men. And so for a Victorian woman to be accused of infidelity was the ultimate in public humiliation. And so this was recognized as a form of emotional battering. In other cases, the husband would appear in social circles with a prostitute on his arm, again, publicly humiliating his wife, and she would use that as grounds for divorce. And in still other cases, there were instances where a husband would use fear and intimidation. One husband said he would continually whisper in his wife's ear at a social occasion that he was going to shoot her when they got home. And she would be terrified, and then they would get home and he wouldn't shoot her, but certainly the fear had done its job. In another case, a man would enact violence on household objects in near vicinity to the woman so that she would be frightened that she'd be next. He would take an axe and smash the clock, or take all her laundry and throw it to the hogs just after it had been freshly washed. And these two were considered acts of emotional violence. So in 1907, it looks like divorce law is beginning to respond to some of women's needs by including mental cruelty under the definition of extreme cruelty. But At the same time, the statute went on to say that this infliction of grievous mental suffering or physical injury had to go on for a period of 1 year immediately before the action for divorce in order to make it a legitimate case. So in other words, you had to tolerate the beating or the mental cruelty for a year before you could even file. Then one other example of the law in practice comes with a case called Ryan versus Ryan, which was heard in 1905. And in this case, Florence Ryan brought action against her husband, James Ryan, alleging that, among other things, quote, he frequently abused and maltreated her, causing her great mental and bodily pain, suffering, and anguish. And then she gave several examples. She said the defendant struck the plaintiff a violent blow and drove her with great force against the barn, causing great bodily suffering. The defendant beat, bruised, and choked the plaintiff. The defendant shoved the plaintiff violently upon the floor and held her down in such a position and then dragged her into another room where he let her go. The defendant grabbed the plaintiff by the arms with great force, threw her upon the floor, and while she was there, held her by the neck and shoulders, then threw her out of the house down 2 steps and upon the ground with such force and violence as to bruise and wound her seriously, and so forth and so on. So you can see the picture is extremely clear that this woman was being battered by her husband. Now, initially, when her case was heard, the judge found in her favor and granted her divorce. However, her husband appealed the case, and the case went to the Montana Supreme Court. And her husband's appeal was based on the simple loophole that in her complaint, she had not actually used the phrase grievous bodily injury. And the law says that grievous bodily injury and bodily injury dangerous to life are facts which must be proved, and in order to be proved, must be pleaded. And it says here, this is in the report of the Supreme Court, it was repeatedly said that these acts caused the plaintiff great bodily and mental pain and suffering, but the complaint does not anywhere allege that they produced grievous bodily injury or bodily injury dangerous to the plaintiff's life. So essentially, what we have here is a ludicrous war of semantics. I mean, I read this and I was appalled. I had my class read it, the entire class was appalled. Fortunately, what happened was that the Supreme Court, again, decided in Florence Ryan's favor. And this one judge, I think speaking with heavy irony, said, let's see, okay. He said, all of the foregoing treatment of the plaintiff after he cited all those accounts of abuse by the defendant have clearly broken her health and caused her great bodily and mental pain and suffering. And then he said, the statute does not require that the injuries inflicted should be permanent, nor does it say how often these injuries have to be repeated in order to constitute, quote, grievous bodily injury, which again is the requirement. And he says, grievous, among other things, means painful. Injury includes in its meaning hurt. So if she's talking about pain and hurt, we can assume she has grievous bodily injury. And then he says, and here's where I think he gets kind of ironic. He goes on, this is Chief Justice Brantley. He said, if a complaint in a divorce case should allege that the husband on one day had chopped off the right foot of the wife maliciously, and 2 days afterwards had chopped off the other foot maliciously, it does not appear to me that it would be necessary for the complaint to go further, and in the exact language of the statute, charge that the defendant had inflicted bodily injury dangerous to life. I think it would be a sufficient allegation simply to describe this complaint. And so Florence Ryan was granted her divorce from James Ryan by the Supreme Court in 1905. And so in this story, all's well, you know, that ends well. But to me, it was remarkable that the husband and his lawyer thought they even had a chance to make that appeal on the basis of this semantical problem. And I think that, to me, is an indication of the fact that the community institutions in Montana at that time did, in fact, condone a certain amount of domestic violence. And depending upon which judge you talked with, they might be more or less lenient or more or less strict. And so this, I think, is a good example of how the problem of domestic violence has not been taken seriously historically by the people in positions of power to help. And again, as I said in the beginning, historians haven't taken it seriously either because there's such a dearth of studies about domestic violence in Montana. One final note I found that was interesting, and I think this has to do with the toxic shame that our culture has historically encouraged in women. In other words, by toxic shame, not taking themselves and their rights and their needs seriously. There were a number of cases cited during this period in the late 19th and early 20th century where a woman would tolerate years of clear physical abuse, but she would only file for divorce once that abuse became public. When her husband actually kicked her in the street in front of someone and embarrassed her, then she would go and file for divorce. And so that's an example of how her public image was more important to her than what was actually happening to her privately. And I think that also is a reflection of that toxic shame of not believing that her own health and safety were important until someone else saw it being violated. So I'm delighted to be at this conference. I think this is the kind of thing that's just so positive. And I look forward to listening to some of the other presenters.